There was a lot to unpack with this one. Patreon review time again. I have not gotten as many of those done in the last few months as I had hoped to. Maybe that'll change, but I'm not going to make promises I can't keep. This one's a book. It is called Peter Darling. So, I think, what might be a legitimately unique experience with this book. Because, due to the fact that I was commissioned to read it, I never read the description. So, based off the title and the cover, I guess okay, this is something kind of Peter Pan related. But that was it. I didn't read the description of this thing literally anywhere. I didn't check Goodreads. I didn't even read the description when I got it on Audible, because yes, I listened to the audiobook. And as a result, the core premise of the thing actually hit me shockingly hard. Like, it almost blindsided me. And I say that, and I want to describe to you what it was like for me to realize what the book was actually about. Because if you look at literally any description, Amazon description, Audible description, Goodreads, whatever, the thing I'm going to tell you that I didn't know is right there. So I'm not sure how many other people had the experience of reading or listening to this book not knowing what the core premise was. So I kind of want to describe that experience to you. Like I said, I could guess from the title and the book cover that this was going to be Peter Pan related. Seems pretty simple to guess. And I was correct. Now, the thing about Peter Pan is you can't really just do the Peter Pan story straight. You need to have some kind of twist to it, some kind of angle that you're working if you're gonna actually try and do anything with it. Otherwise, you're just telling the story everybody knows. So this starts, and it's actually set about 10 years after Pan had already left. So we're already dealing with kind of a pseudo sequel, but Pan left and now has returned to Neverland. So initially I'm like, oh, okay, so that's the twist. Things are a little bit later on. But the dynamics were largely intact, despite the fact that everybody had gotten older, including the people who stayed in Neverland. The Lost Boys, Hook, they all aged the amount of time that Peter was gone. So the notion that you don't age in Neverland doesn't appear to actually have ever been the case. And I'm like, okay, so that's a slightly new wrinkle. It's going forward. There's some mention of when Peter left and came back to Neverland, that he left behind his brothers, and it mentions John and Michael. And so those are the other Darling boys. And at that point I was like, oh, okay, so Peter went back with Wendy and was kind of adopted into the family, because he's the narrative's kind of referring to John and Michael as his brothers, so that's how he thinks of them now. Okay, I think I'm with this so far. But then in chapter 2, it's describing what happened the night that Peter came back to Neverland. And it talks about him getting some of his father's clothes and like having to hem the pant legs or whatever, but wanting to hide his body. So I'm like, okay, is this like a fear of aging thing? Like he wants to cover up the fact that he's gotten older and he's kind of hiding from that and doesn't want to deal with that. Is that what we're doing? And then it made mention of Peter cutting off quite a substantial amount of hair. That's where I was like, that's weird. That's weird. Boys wouldn't have been allowed to grow their hair all that long. And then it mentions Peter's parents outside pounding on the door and saying, Wendy, what are you doing in there? And when I tell you that what I realized what that meant, I was driving the car, but literally one of my hands came off the wheel and went, ooh. I literally gobsmacked. Peter is Wendy. Peter is a trans man. And Peter is the identity that he has taken and has longed for because that's who he wants to be. That's why when he was going through, before going to Neverland in the first place, always telling the stories, he always played Peter and he always made John play Hook. And one of the things that's great about this, both in terms of the progression of the narrative, but just like as a trans person, I really appreciate the narrative only ever refers to him as Peter and uses he, him pronouns. The only time you ever hear the name Wendy or hear Peter referred to as she is when it's being done by other characters from flashbacks back in London. The narrative only ever calls him Peter, and all the characters in Neverland only ever call him Peter. And that, like, the general idea of like, oh, this character is actually also this other character, like that in many ways is very played out and often nonsensical twist. Here, weirdly, it actually like fixes some problems, not inherent insurmountable problems, but things that are frequently problems when you tell Peter Pan stories. The big one being Peter is kind of a dick. Peter is, very immature and very obsessed with like, I want to fight pirates and have these adventures. And like, he's very one note. He's very single-minded as a character. And he's hard to do much with as a result. What this take does, it contextualizes that desire to go and fight pirates, be at war with Hook, because that's what Peter thinks being a boy is. And he doesn't want to be a man, he wants to be a boy. Because he has some understanding of what being a boy is. Because he's been socialized in London to be a girl and to learn to be a woman, but he doesn't want that. But he also doesn't really understand what it means to be a boy. He just knows what he sees boys being and getting to be that is denied to him. And that is roughhousing, climbing trees, the exaggeration of that in Neverland being flying, and fighting. Play fighting, real fighting, whatever. That's what boys do. And so that's why Peter is so focused on this. He wants so badly to live the masculine life denied to him, but he doesn't actually know what that is. His best understanding is that, well, boys fight. And that's actually his justification at one point. He gets asked, why do you always want to fight? And his answer is just, I'm a boy. Because that's all he understands. I think back to my own gender journey. My own days, the early parts where, bizarrely, I still thought I was a cisgender male who liked cross-dressing. But, set that aside for a moment. The reality was that at the time, for me to feel feminine, I had to drape myself in so many things. It had to be the way. It had to be full makeup. It had to be as smoothly shaved as possible. I had to shave my legs. I had to shave whatever very minimal amounts of body hair that I actually had to be short skirts, had to be rather sizable breast forms, larger than what I've actually developed on HRT, had to be heels. I needed all of it because I wasn't raised to understand what it meant to be feminine. And so those early days, I latched onto the superficials because that's what I understood. And it was only through time and getting to a better sense of myself and existing that I came to understand, like, no, that's not it. It's one of those things that gets thrown at trans feminine people and trans women, like, oh, do you really think just putting on a skirt and stuff, you think that's being a woman? No. But understanding what it is to be feminine is something that is frequently denied to people who are raised to be boys. And so we latch onto the things that we do understand. And yes, we do in fact get a deeper understanding over time that, yeah, it's obviously more than that, but it's a starting point. And that is how Peter being a trans man recontextualizes the very nature of what Peter Pan even is. It's really smart and it's really well done. And the dynamic between him and Hook, I have some issues with it. And so everything I've talked about up to this point is the core premise of the book. So none of that was really spoilers. And that stuff is wonderful. I do need to talk a bit more about Hook and Pan as a dynamic. And that is a bit more spoilery. Know that I am still recommending the book. I do have some issues with that. So consider this to be your spoiler marker. I'm not going to go like tell you about like the very end or anything, but this is going to be talking more about developments that happen later. So initially, I really loved the dynamic between Hook and Pan because it's very clear that Hook has been very bored in Neverland without Pan there. And there's this wonderful moment. I loved this so much where he has Pan like all tied up and he's about to have his pirates throw him overboard into an area with the crocodiles. And Pan says, "I'll be back." And Hook just goes, "Oh God, I hope so." It's so good. I love that. As it goes on, the narrative, it's not the worst contrivance in the world, but eventually the narrative contrives the two of them trapped in a cave by the Kraken and trying to find their way out and having to work together. And from there going forward, we get the eventual development of a very sexually charged and romantically inclined relationship between the two of them. So my inherent discomfort with that has to do with the nature of the power dynamics, which, yes, does include an age gap. Now, age gaps get really tricky to talk about. Here's the thing about age gaps. Age gaps are not inherently insurmountably immoral in terms of relationship power dynamics. However, age gaps, especially when the younger person is, early 20s or younger, age gaps tend to lean into not good power dynamics. They just do. Do they 100% of the time? No, but it's a very abusable situation. And that alone makes me uncomfortable. And ultimately, the general problem with age gaps like that is less the raw number of years. It's the difference in life experience. When you have an adult who's been living an adult existence and understands what it means to feel adult feelings, interacting in that way with someone who is only just starting to experience life as an adult, that is an experience gap that leaves a lot of room for abuse of power in the dynamic. That having been said, I would actually say that this particular dynamic between Hook and Pan does everything that I can possibly think of to take the curse off this notion. Like, if the age gap alone, because, like, if I were to guess, I'd say Peter in this is probably about 20. That's my guess, like late teens at the youngest, but I think he's about 20. Hook has got to be 40s. It's possible even older. Like, the youngest Hook could possibly would be latter half 30s. But that doesn't ring true to me. To me, it's 40s, 50s would be equally believable. And so if that age gap and the development of romantic feelings between two characters with that age gap is something that you can't overcome, fair, walk away from the book. If you are willing to at least give it a shot, again, like, I can't say that I 100% got over my own discomfort, but I will say again, the narrative does just about everything that I think it could do to take the curse off this notion. Because for starters, there is zero indication that Hook ever felt this way about him before Peter returned to Neverland as an adult, a young adult, yes, but as an adult. So that kind of pulls the predatory nature off it a little bit. There's really no inclination of any intent to groom. And also, thanks to the inherent ability of a piece of work like this to give us the actual thoughts of the characters, we know that Peter is starting to feel these things actually possibly even slightly sooner than Hook is. So it has that same advantage that I talked about way back on the main channel when I brought up issues of dubious consent, and talked about how it tends to work a lot better in written works where you can literally hear inside a character's head and hear that they are okay and or desiring it, as opposed to having to intuit it in a visual medium like film, television, etc. So it has that kind of stuff going for it. There is more to their dynamic than just sexual tension. That's not the only thing going on. There's other things that connect them and give them ways to relate to each other as the story progresses beyond just that. That's a bit more spoilery. I don't want to get into specifics on that, but that's not the sexual and romantic build is not the only thing they have going on. So that helps. And like I said, while for me at least, there is an inherent discomfort with this dynamic just because Peter has zero adult experience. Peter is just barely starting to figure out that being a boy or a man is more than just fighting all the time. And he really doesn't have a handle on the kinds of things he's experiencing. And that gives me discomfort. Like, I understand that in the abstract, the notion of somebody with more experience able to cushion and guide a younger person going through a volatile emotional state could be a net positive. I understand that in theory. In practice, I've not seen that happen in real life. What I've seen is people, usually guys in their 40s and up, claiming that that's what they're going to do, that they're going to be that cushion, that they're going to be that comfort, that they're going to guide someone to a better understanding, and just taking advantage of that. Now, again, that is not what happens in this narrative. And I don't even think I'd argue that this story is romanticizing overtly that kind of connection. Like, again, a lot of what connects them, it has to do with the fantastical nature of this setting. But for me to say it doesn't romanticize it, like, that's not true. It does a little bit by its nature. I don't think it goes out of its way to. It does romanticize it. I don't think it glorifies it. Maybe that's a better way to put it. While this does kind of inherently romanticize this age gap between these two characters, it doesn't glorify it. And it does kind of treat it a bit more as these two, for various reasons, are going to understand each other better than probably anybody else could understand either of them. And the book sells that well. I still personally would kind of rather it didn't go there. But since it did, I do actually think it handled it about as well as it was going to be handled. So if that's not something that bothers you, great. If that's a complete deal breaker, fair enough. And if you're someone like me where like, okay, I'll keep going, but I kind of wish you hadn't done that. Again, it handles it about as well as I think it was going to be handled. I love the core premise more than I like the direction of the narrative, but the direction of the narrative isn't a waste of the premise. It actually builds on the premise in interesting ways. It just goes in a direction that I personally would have preferred it didn't, even though it goes in that direction pretty well. This is still a good book. I just can't recommend it without reservation, and I want to be able to do that because like the core idea is so good and so well delivered. But yeah, I feel like I got to give people a fair heads up about what goes on between the two of them as characters. But yeah, Peter Darling, have you heard of this? Have you read it? What do you think about any of the stuff that I've talked about? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon is how I was commissioned to take a look at this. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. Those also help me out. But don't worry too much about it. We take a relaxed attitude around here, so you can just come on back the next time that you need a break. And now it's time to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Goddess Elida, Zubin Lutfulla, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Renobulax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam RDL Taylor, Pal Barabajoggle, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. You can hear me try and say your name while dealing with these guys crawling all over me by checking out the reward tiers on my Patreon. See you next time.